Hi, everyone. It's Tony Cottaspoti for the Great Vocal Majority podcast and blog. Today, I want to talk about a statistic that comes out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics that is not very often mentioned. You almost never hear it mentioned, as a matter of fact, in the news. And it impacts directly our understanding of the controversial number called the labor force or workforce participation rate. Now, it's very well understood that the workforce participation rate today is lower than it's been since the late 1970s. That's a fact that no one disputes. Nevertheless, what is disputed is the cause of it. There are some people writing articles in some very prestigious magazines declaring that the increase in the number of people leaving the workforce is driven primarily by retirees. And I would dispute that because the Bureau of Labor Statistics has data that tracks the movement of people in and out of different workforce statuses. It's called the workforce status flows, and let me show, or labor force status flows, and I want to show it to you. I want to give you an idea of what it looks like on the web, and here it is. This is the data retrieval side of this, and what it does, it shows flows into and out of each of the categories. Now, there are several categories. There's employment, there's unemployment, and there's not in the labor force, just those three categories. But there is a dynamic every month of people moving in and out of these categories. So let's take them one by one, and I'll explain how these all work. So here's the first section called flows into employment. So first they give you the total employment number that's reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics each month, and you can query that for both seasonally and adjusted and not seasonally adjusted stats for men, women, and in total. Then they have people, and remember what this is saying, this is where were you at the beginning of the month and what status were you at the end of the month. So at the beginning of the month you were employed, at the end of the month you were employed. So these were people who were employed for the entire month. And you can query that. And here we have unemployed to employed. Now, obviously, if you're unemployed at the beginning of the month, you were looking for work and you found work. So this statistic here tells us the number of people who found work in a month. The Bureau of Labor Statistics actually tracks that number. They also track this number, people who were not in the labor force and then became employed. Now, this is interesting because this is an interesting statistic because this statistic will tell us when people begin to think the economy is turning around and let's say where they used to be a discouraged worker, but they're no longer discouraged because they're hearing that there are jobs available and they say, you know what, I'm going to go out and start looking for a job. And they do that in a month, which technically makes them unemployed during the month. But then at the end of the month, before the month ended, they found a job. And that would be someone who would fall into this statistic here. This other number is just a rounding, so I'm not even going to address it. But we'll go into the flows into unemployment. So there's the total unemployed. That's the number that you sometimes hear about. It's not the percentage, it's the actual number of people. Then you have people who are employed at the beginning of the month, but they end up unemployed by the end of the month. And what kind of people would be in that number? Well, those are people who've been laid off or their companies went out of business. Then you have people who are unemployed and at the beginning of the month and they were unemployed at the end of the month. That's obviously people who couldn't find work during the month. And then you have people who were not in the labor force but became unemployed. Now, those people relate very closely to these people up here. The only difference being is that these guys up here found work. These guys down here are still looking. And remember, all within the month. So what's interesting about these statistics is that it shows you the puts and takes of people coming into and coming out of each category every month. And then we have this final category, the flows into not in labor force. Of course, there's the total, as there is in the other two categories. Then there are people who are employed at the beginning of the month, but then they went into not in the labor force at the end of the month. Now, what kind of people would be in that category? Those would be primarily people who are retiring. Now, it's not exclusively that. It could be people who went on disability because they had an accident and they're no longer in the labor force, at least temporarily. Those people could be in there too, but by far and away, the vast majority of people in this category are going to be retirees. Then you have unemployed people who are no longer in the labor force. So they began the month unemployed, that means looking for work, but they ended the month not in the labor force, which means not looking for work. So what kind of people would be in this category? These would be discouraged workers. And then, of course, you have people who began and ended the month out of the labor force. And this would include both discouraged workers and retirees and people on disability. It would include everybody in there. So having looked at that, what I did is I went back and I said, you know what? I'd like to track over time the people who were employed and then left the labor force in any given month. And I want to see what that number looks like over time, see what kind of a pattern develops. Those are retirees. I'll label those retirees. And these people here, I'll label discouraged workers, people who are unemployed, that they're no longer in the labor force. And so I tracked these two categories and I put it in a chart. And that's what I'm going to show you now. Do this as a slideshow. And swap it there. There we go. Now, this is a 20-year chart. It starts in January of 1995 and goes all the way to December of 2015. The top line here is how the number of retirees every single month for the last 20 years has looked. That is, people who started the month in the labor force, ended the month not in the labor force. And down here, we have what I call discouraged workers, which are people who started the month unemployed and ended the month not in the labor force. And what you see by looking at this is that retirees pretty much from 1995 to approximately 2013, the number of retirees every month was between 3.5 to 4 million people. Pretty much. That's been stable. Only recently has it broken through the $4 million barrier and gone above it. So now it's between 4 to 4.5 million retirees, but that's only over the last 2 years. So let's look now at discouraged workers. Looking at them, you could see that they averaged between 1.5 to 2 million people from 1995 all the way up until just prior to the time Barack Obama was inaugurated as president. And it broke through that range right at the end of 2008. And look at the bubble of people that were out of the labor force. Remember, each one of these data points is what happened in a given month. So what you're seeing is the fluctuation of people leaving the workforce from being unemployed. It has never gone that high, and it stayed up there. I mean, it stayed up there it went above that line just prior to Obama's inauguration, and it hasn't gone back to its historic. This is what I'll call this here, from here to here, I'll call the historical range. It has only just gotten back into the historical range. So in other words, this tells you that the increase in the number of people leaving the workforce and the consequent decrease in the workforce participation rate is not being driven by retirees, because that's only a recent development. It's being driven by people who've left the workforce because they've been discouraged. And it's only now beginning to come back. Just right here, right at the very end. So when people tell you that the workforce participation rate decline is being driven by retirees, they are not giving an accurate picture. I wouldn't say that they're lying, because the number of retirees is certainly a factor. I mean, the number of retirees is double the number of people that are leaving the workforce. So their impact on the average is going to be greater. But that has only occurred very recently. Over the first 6 or 7 years of the Obama administration, it's been discouraged workers leaving the workforce and staying out of the workforce. That's what this big bubble above this dotted line represents. People who have left the workforce and have stayed out of it. That's a systemic change, and it's only now beginning to recover. And that's a long time for people to be out of work. You're talking 6, 7 years in here. So I wanted to bring this to you to explode this myth. Now, maybe going forward, if the economy rights itself and gets back into this range down here where we've seen discouraged workers leaving the workforce at the more historical average, and we see an increase in retirees continuing in this channel upward, then you could say going forward that the number of retirees would be driving the decline in the workforce participation rate. But that certainly has not been the case since the time Obama's been inaugurated. That is clear from this chart. That's what I wanted to bring to everybody today. I hope you got something out of this. The website is greatvocalmajority.com. Thanks, everybody. I'll speak to you soon.